Hello, and welcome to Senior Connections. This is your monthly look at all things for older adults. It's brought to you by Senior Resources, which is your local area agency on aging. Every month we have a different topic that's related to our older adults and their caregivers, and we try to impart some information on you that you might not know or need a reminder of. So we're here to help navigate what can be a sometimes complex system of services that are available. And I'm excited because this month we have my longtime friend Dan Bonner from Legal Aid. He is the managing partner of Legal Aid of Western Michigan. It's always so fun to chat with you, Dan.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Dan and I have known each other for well over 25 years in the nonprofit world here in Muskegon, and you've been with Legal Aid longer than that. So tell us a little bit about your background. First of all, what made you decide to go into law? It's a long road to go into law, so you had to have a passion.
It's true. I grew up in the 60s, and back then our generation was out to save the world, and now I'm just trying to save my little piece of it, one client at a time. And so I went into legal aid because the concept of social justice and using a law degree to help the less fortunate people was something that appealed to me. And so I've been doing it for almost 35 years.
So since you were a baby, is what you're telling me. So did you start with legal aid right after you got your law degree, or did you do, because, it's Legal Aid's a great organization, and I'm excited to tell people more about it, but it's probably, you could be in a more lucrative area of law than working for a nonprofit law firm, admittedly.
I started Legal Aid right out of law school.
Great.
Yep.
So how did you learn about it? Is it something you did some volunteer work with in law school, or?
Well, I knew about Legal Aid's reputation back in when it first started nationally in the mid-'60s as part of President Johnson's war on poverty.
Okay.
And it was basically poverty lawyers then assisting less fortunate. Now, we've expanded the scope of our services to include, especially for the guests who might be watching today, senior citizens, and especially we have a wonderful relationship with Senior Resources, and have enjoyed that for years too. So.
Great. So I didn't realize that it started about the time you were coming of age. So Legal Aid, Dan Bonner coming of age in the 60s when, you're right, social justice was really becoming a really big thing with a certain generation.
It was.
And so wonderful that you've been with it for that whole time. So even though people might have heard of Legal Aid, like you said, it's gone through a lot of changes since it was started. Tell us a little bit about it. What is the focus? So you said it originally started focusing on poverty. It's expanded a little bit, but why did it come about? Tell us more about President Johnson starting that.
That's a good question, Lisa. Now, in 1963, we had
a great year, I should add, when I was born.
Okay, there you go. Yes.
I've just aged myself, but.
Well, in the year you were born, there was a case called Gideon versus Wainwright, where our Supreme Court said people accused of crimes in the United States were entitled under the Constitution to court-appointed attorneys because their freedom was at stake. In some states, their lives. However, that constitutional right to a court-appointed attorney does not extend to the civil side, the side of the law where divorces are done, landlord-tenant, real estate, the vast majority of our
So it's only
stuff.
for criminal cases.
Right,
really.
that was only for criminals. So in that failure to provide what we call meaningful access to justice for people in civil cases to assert their rights was established nationally under the Office of Economic Opportunity, and then under, of all people, President Nixon is the one that signed the legislation creating Legal Aid, the Legal Aid and Services Corporation in 1974.
Okay.
Yeah. And so we've been around, and there's a Legal Aid office to serve every county in the United States, Lisa.
Oh, wow. So kind of like area agencies on aging are all over the place.
Exactly.
We not have one in every single community, but every community is served that way.
Exactly.
It's kind of hard to believe that before 63 we didn't, I think we've just always known you have a right to an attorney. It's those Miranda rights where they say all that. So that wasn't always, you had a right if you could afford one.
Exactly.
Before that.
Yep.
So they equalized it, or tried to equalize it a little bit more. Interesting.
And when you mention that, they talk about equal justice under law, which is what's imposed over our Supreme Court of the United States. But to add to that, the good point that you meant was equal justice under law if you can afford it.
That was that really, really fine print in there, the granite. So how many attorneys are there at Legal Aid, and what area do you cover?
Yep, there's 5 of us there now, And our geographic service area constitutes 6 counties in western Michigan: Muskegon, Newaygo, Oceana, Mason, Lake, and Osceola. Now, that's out of our Muskegon office. Right. Legal Aid of Western Michigan is a 17-county program with our headquarters in Grand Rapids.
Okay. Wonderful. And so have you been in the Muskegon office all of those 35
the
years?
The entire time.
Wow. So we are very fortunate to have you.
Oh, that's very kind of you to
So we talked a little bit about for those who can afford it. Legal assistance can be really expensive. I mean, which is apparently why Legal Aid was started. But how do you help with that? Is there a income limit for people, or how does that work to make it affordable for people?
There are 2 prongs to eligibility for our services, Lisa. One is the nature of the case. So we don't do criminal defense. We have a public defender's office for that. And we also don't do what are called fee-generating cases, the 1-800-CALL-SAM cases, or we have some very fine personal injury lawyers in town, or workers' comp, where the poorest person with a good case can get the best attorney on what's called a contingency fee basis. Right. So we don't do those 2 major types of cases. But then we do the rest of the gamut of civil law. And the other prong is the financial eligibility prong. They have to be, our prospective clients have to be at or below 125% of federal poverty, and we have a chart to determine that.
Okay. And roughly how much of the population falls into that? I'm not saying how many actually need your services, but do you have any idea how much of in Muskegon area, and certainly in some of our northern counties, that's got to be a fairly substantial.
Right, and I can't recall with the census, the 2010 census figures, I can't recall the exact number, but it is a large part. And the other thing is that there are not nearly enough legal aid attorneys to meet the overwhelming need. And in fact, I tell people the only part of the job I haven't liked in 35 years is having to politely decline some people who weren't hurting as bad as some other people.
Because you have to pick the greatest needs.
Exactly.
Because there's and you've not been wanting for work, I am sure, in any of that time. So we're talking things like it could be divorces, it could be, I know it's domestic violence issues, and we're going to talk about all the things relating to our older adults, but it can be civil things. It could be child custody, maybe, if there's something like that.
Custody, divorce, and we've limited it only to divorces where there's physical violence going on. And unfortunately,
there's too much of that.
There's too much of that.
I'm sure you're not. Unfortunately, you can't. You're probably turning away cases there too, sadly.
Right. Yeah.
And I know that you have a great working relationship with Every Woman's Place.
We do. It's one of our best community partners because we have a perfect relationship because we provide their clients with an attorney that they need at that point in time, and they provide our clients with the immediate need for shelter and safety.
Great. So let's talk a little. Well, let's ask a couple other things. What kind of hours are you available for people?
Well, our official hours are 8:30 to 5, and but then we. I get a lot of my work done after 5 when we lock the front door, because all day long is either on the road in courts or doing seeing clients in the office and that kind of thing. But 5 days a week.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about after hours? If there is if somebody comes across the need for something after hours, is there a way for them to get help? Is there an 800 number or any other website or anything they can go to, or are they basically waiting until Monday comes?
We have. In Michigan, the Access to Justice branch of our state bar has funded, and we have some brilliant attorneys who are a lot smarter than me when it comes to computer stuff, have developed a website statewide that can be located for the viewers at michiganlegalhelp.org. Okay. It's all one word, michiganlegalhelp.org.
Okay.
And that's accessible 24 hours a day. And there's a directory of we call toolkits for all different types of law, and it can walk people through the question answers and the forms they need for their particular
so they can get a jump start if they need to, so when they do get in to see somebody. So if you can't remember that number, you can always call 211, and I know that they'll have that information as well. So now let's talk a little bit about older adults. So that wasn't at the beginning of legal aid. That came a little bit longer, that a focus on older adults came?
Yep, with the Older Americans Act came some funding, and part of that funding through Older Americans Act was to provide legal assistance to adults 60 years of age and older, the same population that's served by Senior Resources. And we're very grateful for funding that we receive through Senior Resources for our work in that arena.
Well, and that's an ever-growing population, so it's going to be needed even more. So we're going to talk a lot about some different issues that you and I have mentioned before. So let's talk about financial exploitation. That can be all kinds of different ways. It can be family members. It can be, we'll talk about scams after that. But what do you see in financial exploitation, and what can you do to help people there?
I've told people, Lisa, that when I first started in this position 35 years ago, the cutting-edge issue that began to have a public face was domestic violence between intimate partners, whether husband-wife or boyfriend-girlfriend or whatever. Now the cutting-edge issue and epidemic is the financial exploitation of vulnerable adults. And a lot of those, of course, are seniors,
Right.
population that we see, but not all. That's correct. What I tell groups sometimes is that when people stole from older adults, they would often come at night. The person had no idea who they were stealing from. They would try to get into a house and leave undetected, and take whatever they could and hope that they weren't caught. Now the people that are stealing from our older adults are coming through the front door in the middle of the day and saying, "Hi, Mom," or their caregivers, or their neighbors, or their
They're trusted people frequently.
Yep, or children, adult children. I've seen that, and at legal aid, I never see the good stories. We always see the problems when they arise. So we've seen a lot of that, and we've addressed that. In fact, in conjunction with Senior Resources, we developed years ago, in fact, probably over 20 years ago, in our 3-county area agency program, we've developed what we call a Tri-County Task Force. And we have a wonderful partnership and working relationship with our prosecuting attorney's office here, DJ Hilson and his staff, with the Adult Protective Services at the DHHS, with Senior Resources, the legal aid, of course, to address the civil side, and a lot of adult caregiver organization. The police, we have a state police trooper named Martin Miller.
He's great.
He's wonderful. He's part of our task force. So we have it's almost like an interdisciplinary team to address this growing problem.
Right. So that's really disheartening to think that it can be adult children. And
yes.
So let's go on to something closely related, scams. Seems like there's always a new scam. You hear, I think we've heard for a lot of times, about somebody who calls and pretends to be a grandchild, and they might disguise it and say they have a bad connection, which is easy to do with technology and cell phones these days, although there's towers everywhere, you'd think that. But talk a little bit about that. That's still out there, I know, but it seems like there's new ones every week almost.
Yes.
What are you seeing, and what can you do about that? I know Trooper Miller talks a lot about that. We're always trying to do education in our area.
Yep.
But what are you seeing?
Yep. In fact, has Trooper Miller been on the show?
Not for a couple of years, and I think it'll be time to get him on again.
Yeah, he's a wonderful resource and speaker, of course. But the scams, like you say, these scammers are not stupid people. And they know how to prey on basically the heartstrings of people. And there's 2 common elements to every scam that I've noticed, Lisa, and that is someone is inviting you to take advantage of something that they're offering, of course, and that if you don't take advantage of it, either something bad is going to happen to you or someone you love, or you're going to miss out on something, or you're going to miss out on something good. And you have to act immediately. Those are always the common elements. I tell, and if the viewers today on this program don't remember a single thing I said today, what I do want them to remember is never give your Social Security number to a person that called you. Right. Because so many times they get lured into conveying personal information. And
your bank isn't going to call you and ask for your Social Security number. Your doctor's office isn't going to call you and ask for that.
Yep.
Right?
Exactly.
You might call your doctor's office for something. They might, they don't usually, but might ask for some verification. But they're not going to call you and say, Mr. Bonner, can you verify who you are by giving me your whole Social Security number?
Yep. Or people posing as your credit card company and saying we put a hold on you.
Or your utilities or something.
Yes.
They come up with the things that make a lot of sense. I can't be without heat or water or phone or oh my goodness, my credit's been compromised or something.
Right.
And a lot of times it's either a phone call or even if they do something in writing or give you a link that can take you to some malware and put something on a computer. They're very crafty.
They are.
It's too bad they can't use those things for good.
Yes. Yep. And we see that a lot with, and they also will access computers. And a lot of seniors too are puzzled. Well, how did the person know my grandchild's name, or how did it's called social media. I mean, people have put so much personal information on Facebook and other outlets of social media that these scammers, what we call it, they fish through that information and pull out these identifying things. So they sound so convincing when they call our seniors and pretend to be a grandchild in trouble.
So what can a senior do if that's happened to them? How can you be helpful to them?
Well, one of the things they can do is, of course, is not bite. Two, then maybe call local law enforcement just to report that, and that allows law enforcement perhaps to, if they see a pattern in a community, they can put out a public service announcement or whatever to alert people to be careful of these scams. And I hear it sometimes on our local news programs that this is the latest.
The IRS scam that was just a couple of months ago.
Yes, yep, exactly. To alert people so that they maybe put that hook and reminder in their minds so that if they do become targeted, that triggers a message to be careful.
And we need to remind people that it's easy to be embarrassed if you feel like you've been duped, and people don't necessarily want to admit that.
Right.
Because they're afraid, especially if they're older adults, they're afraid that my kids or my family's going to think that I can't live on my own or I can't take care of myself because I fell for this. But it's really important to share that information because they can do that to people who are much younger and who have their wits about them and are perfectly fine, just as most of these older adults are, that happened. It is not it's not an indictment on their intelligence, I guess is what I'm saying.
And that raises a question too, how often I've had seniors come and speak to me about being victims of larceny type offenses by their own children, but yet they don't want to prosecute, certainly. They don't even want legal aid, our office, to sue the child who might be working, where we can recover the money because they just, they love the child and all that, but they don't realize that their child, in this particular instance, treated them like a criminal.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So do you try to counsel people to try to convince them that they should
do
that? Because that's what you're trying to do, is recover some assets or make sure that they don't do that to somebody else.
Is restore the senior to the treasure that got stolen from them, that they've worked their whole lives for. The other thing I often am very aware of in our office is the scenario where an adult child will bring in an elderly parent wanting a power of attorney.
Okay, that was the next thing I was going to ask
good,
about.
Okay,
That.
We see one of the tools that people in close relationships with vulnerable adults, for example, adult children, or maybe a neighbor or whatever, luring the senior, in the instances we're talking about, into signing a power of attorney, giving them the authority, basically, or like a key to all of their treasure, all of their personal possessions, accounts, bank accounts and those kind of things, credit card information. And when I see that dynamic, I look for some red flags. A couple red flags I look for is if I meet the senior in the lobby and there's an adult child there and I ask to speak to the senior alone in my office just to check for this, and I get pushback from that adult child about meeting with the senior alone, that's a red flag. If I ask the senior in my office, does the person out in the lobby have brothers or sisters? And if they say yes, I say, well, what if I called his brother George and said, your brother Mike is here with your mother and wants a power of attorney. What's your take on that? If I get a senior that's saying, I don't want you to call my other children, that's a red flag, because one of the common elements of these types of things is that child targets mom or dad and then isolates them and then takes advantage of them.
So for our viewers, what exactly can a power of attorney do?
Yep.
So if a child comes to them and says, Mom, I think I should be your power of attorney, they might not know what that means.
Right, that's a
They might
good
think,
thing.
okay, that's not until I'm incapacitated, and I don't need, because they might tell them that. But
Right.
they might sign something. Lots of us sign things without reading everything. So it's good
That's
for us to know, what does a power of attorney do?
Yep, and it's an excellent question, and I also don't want to discount the power of attorney.
Right, it's
because
needed
it's a
sometimes.
wonderful estate planning tool as part of a package. But the power of attorney itself is a document that allows another person to act on your behalf in legal matters, usually that require documents that require signatures, banking, those types of things.
Signing on a car loan, a house loan,
Exactly.
remortgaging your house,
Right.
any of those things that many of us have done for years. Credit cards even.
And we have this wonderful exception in the law called making powers of attorney durable, so that it's kind of a contract that continues even beyond the time when one of the parties, usually the senior, loses mental capacity, slides into that terrible plight of dementia. And that continues. Now, a lot of people don't realize that powers of attorney do end at the death of either party. They don't function as a will.
Right, okay. So there certainly are times if, for example, somebody's been diagnosed with Alzheimer's or something, that probably is time to be talking about a power of attorney while you still are capable of making those decisions, but you know that you're having a decline is coming.
Right.
So that probably is. But if you're perfectly healthy and managing your finances and doing that, and all of a sudden somebody comes to you and says, Mom, I think you need to have me be a power of attorney, but don't tell my brother about
Right.
it or whatever, then maybe you need to be a little concerned about
That's a
that.
red flag.
If you've never had some discussions
Yes,
about that.
a red
So,
flag.
okay, well, that's good to know. Evictions. I know that you do a lot of work in that arena. Not everybody owns their homes, and sometimes they do, but when they get older, they don't want to have the upkeep, and so they're renting someplace. What have
Yes.
you seen about evictions?
Well, with the eviction, most of our landlord-tenant cases involve younger people who don't have sufficient income to rent anything but some of the substandard housing in our core neighborhoods, and we get involved in that. The evictions I have often done for, well, not often, but we get requests sometimes for seniors, are those individuals who maybe a spouse has passed away, they're living alone, they have a son or a daughter. Again, we're talking about adult children. And I know out in the audience there's millions of wonderful adult children. But
We're only talking about the few bad apples out there. The vast majority of you are wonderful.
That's right, exactly. I'm glad
We're wonderful people.
That's right. That we clarified
Yeah.
that. But I don't see those children.
Right. Well, as you said before, you don't hear the good stories.
That's
I mean, this
exactly
is
right.
you're helping people
Yep.
in times of crisis.
Yep.
So they're not coming, Dan, let me tell you about this, and I don't need you at all. But
Yeah.
that's happening in your personal life, but not in your business life, probably.
Yeah, and I've seen situations, Lisa, where an adult child and sometimes a boyfriend and maybe some unruly children of those two will move into the home of a senior and begin to take advantage. So that the senior in her twilight years or his twilight years, when they should have the comfort and peace of their own home, they're getting more and more shunted into a corner. And I've had situations where I've sued to undo a quitclaim deed where the adult child is eventually convinced the senior, talked them into it, or many times mentally battered them into signing a deed to their house, and then they evict their parent.
Oh, my.
Yeah, I've seen those situations.
Oh.
Or I get calls from your agency, Senior Resources, from the wonderful caseworkers there, with a situation where it's become intolerable. There's not physical abuse going on, and otherwise the police would remove them. But they need to remove
Emotional abuse or something.
emotional abuse, exactly. And I've done evictions for seniors where I'm evicting their own child and boyfriend and all their friends that have moved in. From the home.
Because that's a hard thing to do on your own. I mean, it's a hard thing to do, and many times they're younger, they just could, I imagine, just refuse to go. No, Grandma, I'm staying right here,
That's
and you're
exactly.
you're 98 pounds, and you're not. I'm 200. You're not going to be able to make me
Right.
go. So,
And Plan B in that instance is we have to go to court. Yeah.
wow. And hoarding. I know that's kind of related sometimes, you've said to that. We see shows, those are popular shows on TV, Hoarders, we've had recently at a providers conference that we had a talk about that. It's truly a big concern for many people of all ages. But how does it relate to seniors? I mean, do we see that as an increasing issue? Is it bigger in 2017 than it was 20 years ago? Did we see hoarding 20 years ago?
I imagine it existed, but it has become such a visible problem now that even the manual that psychiatrists and psychologists used, called a DSM, or Diagnostic Statistical Manual, just a few years ago, added hoarding as its own category of a mental illness, of a mental disability. And where we see it impacting our population, especially the seniors, is when they live in a multi-unit senior living situation, and their apartments are packed wall to wall with goods, and they're threatened with eviction because it presents a fire danger, fire hazard, and all that to the entire building and the other occupants.
True. So there could be, I'm not going to name any, I don't want to imply that a housing, but we have lots of areas around that are senior housing.
Yep.
So if you've got only just a path through there, I know anybody we could ever invite from the fire department would tell us it's hazardous to fire departments, they can't get in, and then you've got all this flammable material. Well, certainly in a housing complex, that could be really, really dangerous. So do you have any quick story about anything you've dealt with hoarding? Is that something you've had to do with recently?
Well, I've had several cases recently, not only in Muskegon County, but I had one in Mason County and Ludington.
We'll talk about them because that doesn't happen here.
Yeah, that's true. But what we try to do is elicit the support of maybe churches or good people who will attempt to, or the Department of Health and Human Services, APS workers and that, to try to partner with the senior to maybe remove this stuff. But there's a psychological attachment to that, the contents that hoarders have, that is extremely difficult to break. It's like trying to take a bottle away from an alcoholic or a cigarette from someone who's nicotine addicted.
Well, and we know that, and I've seen it in my own grandparents who are all no longer with us, but anybody who grew up in the Depression era, especially, they had so little that sometimes when they do, they hold on to it. And it's one thing to have a hobby, like I collect some snow babies and things, but sometimes those things can take over, and then you develop this real emotional attachment to something, and even things that wouldn't mean anything to you and I, but that pile of newspapers that gets higher and higher every time, they might have, I intend to read that or whatever, but that gets really dangerous for people because that's such a fire hazard.
Right.
So,
and it could threaten a subsidized housing arrangement for the senior. That's my concern, is they're going to lose their housing.
And then where are they going to
go?
Exactly. So great information. We've got about a minute left, so I'm going to take a second to mention that coming up on Tuesday, September 26th is a senior symposium that are you going to be at that?
I will be.
So that's something that our Tri-County Protection Team that we're both part of will be doing. It's at the Folkert Community Hub on Seminole. It's coordinated really through AgeWell Services. Call 211 to get that information because I don't remember the number right offhand. But it will, Trooper Miller's going to be talking about scams and identity theft, which is a whole other conversation. Lots of other good information there. But I want to thank you, Dan, for coming and being our guest and sharing some really valuable information from Legal Aid. You can always find out more information about Legal Aid by calling the Muskegon number 231-726-4887 or check their website at www.lawestmi.org, or as always you can call 211. Thanks for joining us this month. We'll see you next month and talk about some other topics on Senior Connections. Thanks for watching.